The lecture hall buzzed with excitement as students from across the galaxy settled into their seats. Professor Zixatheta, a tall crystalline being from Arcturus Prime, stood before the holographic display showing various species engaged in warfare throughout galactic history. His 6 eyes gleamed as he prepared to begin the most important lesson of the semester. Today we discuss the Forbidden Species Protocols, Professor Zixatheta announced, his voice resonating through the translation devices worn by each student, specifically why humans are banned from all galactic warfare under the Treaty of Seven Suns. A young Kethmari student named Vash raised one of her 4 arms. Her blue scales shimmered under the artificial lighting. Professor, humans look so weak and primitive. They have no natural weapons, no enhanced strength, and their technology seems basic compared to ours. Why would they be forbidden? Several other students nodded in agreement. The classroom contained representatives from dozens of species. The massive rock-like granite people, the telepathic mind-weavers with their flowing tentacles, the lightning-fast Zephyrians with their metallic wings, and many others. All of them possessed natural advantages that seemed far superior to anything humans could offer. Professor Zixatheta's crystalline features shifted in what other species recognized as amusement. An excellent question, Vash. Let me begin with a story that occurred 300 years ago, during the Crimson War between the Hegemony and the Free Worlds Alliance. The holographic display changed to show a massive space battle. Thousands of ships exchanged fire in the darkness between stars. The professor continued. At this time, humans were newly discovered members of the galactic community. They had been contacted only 50 years earlier, and were considered a minor species. The Free Worlds Alliance, desperate for any advantage against the Hegemony's superior numbers, decided to hire human mercenaries. A granite student named Boulder Who Thinks spoke up, his voice like grinding stone. Mercenaries? But humans have no special abilities. What could they possibly offer in a war between advanced civilizations? That is exactly what everyone thought, Professor Zixatheta replied. The Alliance hired a single human regiment called the Devil Dogs to assist in the defense of Kepler Station, a critical supply depot. The Hegemony sent their elite destroyer fleet to capture it. The fleet consisted of 50 battleships, 200 cruisers, and over 1,000 fighter craft. The display showed the approaching Hegemony fleet, a massive armada that blocked out the stars. The students watched in fascination as the professor zoomed in on Kepler Station, a modest installation with minimal defenses. The Alliance had only 12 ships defending the station, plus the human regiment of 300 soldiers. The professor continued. The Hegemony commander, Admiral Thaxnos of the Conquest caste, was so confident of victory that he broadcast his intention to capture the station within 1 standard hour. A Mindweaver student named Thought Drifter projected curiosity through her mental emanations. What weapons did these humans carry? Plasma cannons? Quantum disruptors? Molecular scramblers? Professor Zixatheta manipulated the display to show images of human soldiers. They carried what they called rifles, primitive kinetic weapons that fired small metal projectiles using chemical explosives. Their armor was basic metal alloy plates. They had no energy shields, no enhanced physiology, and no advanced targeting systems. The students exchanged glances of disbelief. How could such primitive beings pose any threat to an advanced military force? The battle began as expected, the professor said. The Hegemony fleet easily destroyed the Alliance ships and began landing troops on the station. Admiral Thaxnos himself led the boarding party, confident that his Conquest caste warriors would quickly overwhelm the defenders. The holographic display showed armored aliens pouring into the corridors of Kepler Station. They were impressive specimens. Each warrior stood nearly 3 meters tall with natural armor plating and built-in weapon systems. Their technology was clearly superior to anything the humans possessed. The Conquest caste warriors moved through the station methodically, expecting minimal resistance from what they considered primitive defenders. They had fought and defeated dozens of species throughout the galaxy. But then they encountered the first human squad. The display showed a narrow corridor where a small group of human soldiers had taken defensive positions behind improvised barricades. They looked tiny compared to the approaching alien warriors. What the Hegemony warriors discovered in that corridor changed the course of galactic history forever, Professor Zixatheta said, his voice dropping to emphasize the importance of what came next. The humans did something that no other species in recorded galactic history had ever done in combat. The students leaned forward in anticipation. Even the typically stoic granite people seemed interested in what revelation was coming. When faced with certain death against superior enemies, the humans smiled, the professor said simply. The classroom fell silent. Several students looked confused by this statement. A young Zephyrian named Swiftwing fluttered her metallic wings in agitation. They smiled. I do not understand, Professor. How is facial expression relevant to combat effectiveness? Professor Zix Theta's 6 eyes focused on each student in turn. Because, my dear Swiftwing, every other species in the galaxy responds to hopeless situations with either fight or flight instincts based on survival logic. We fight when we can win, and we retreat or surrender when we cannot. This is rational behavior. He paused for effect. Humans are not rational in the way we understand rationality. When faced with impossible odds, when defeat seems certain, when any logical being would surrender or flee, humans become more dangerous, not less. The holographic display zoomed in on one of the human faces in the corridor. The soldier was indeed smiling, but there was something unsettling about the expression that made several students uncomfortable. The human squad leader, Sergeant Maria Santos, looked directly at the approaching Conquest Caste warriors and spoke into her communication device. Her exact words, according to the station's recording systems, were, "Well, boys, looks like we're outnumbered 10-1 by 7-foot-tall armored monsters with energy weapons. This is going to be fun." Professor Zixitheta manipulated the display to show what happened next, but stopped just before the action began. Before we continue with what occurred in that corridor, let me ask you this. What do you think those words meant? What could possibly be fun about facing certain death? The students sat in thoughtful silence, trying to comprehend the alien mindset they were being asked to understand. None of them had an answer that made sense according to their understanding of logical behavior. Professor Zixitheta observed his students' confused expressions before continuing the lesson. The holographic display remained frozen on the moment before the first human-alien combat encounter, showing the confident Conquest Caste warriors advancing toward the impossibly outgunned human defenders. To understand what happened next, the professor said, you must first understand something fundamental about human psychology that makes them unique among all known species. Humans possess what they call spite. It is a concept that translates poorly into most galactic languages. A Mindweaver student named Deep Thinker projected a questioning thought. We have analyzed human emotions through our telepathic observations. Spite appears to be a form of illogical anger directed at achieving victory specifically to deny enemy satisfaction. This seems counterproductive to survival. Precisely, Professor Zixtheta replied. Spite is indeed counterproductive to individual survival. However, it becomes devastatingly effective as a military doctrine. When applied collectively, humans would rather die achieving a Pyrrhic victory than live with surrender. They consider certain defeats worse than death. The display resumed, showing the corridor battle. What happened defied every expectation of logical combat behavior. Instead of taking defensive positions and fighting conventionally, the humans did something unprecedented. Sergeant Santos gave an order that no military commander in galactic history had ever issued. The professor explained. She told her squad to make them regret coming here. Not to defeat the enemy, not to hold the position, but specifically to ensure the enemy would regret their decision to attack. The students watched in fascination as the humans abandoned their defensive positions and charged directly at the superior alien forces. But this was not a desperate last stand driven by panic. The humans moved with calculated precision, using their environment in ways no other species had conceived. Vash the Kethmari raised her arm again. Professor, their actions appear to be suicide. How does death serve any strategic purpose? Watch carefully, Professor Zixitheta instructed. Notice that the humans are not simply attacking. They are targeting specific systems in the station itself. The display showed human soldiers using their primitive explosives not against the aliens directly, but against the station's structural supports, power conduits, and life support systems. They fought while simultaneously sabotaging their own position. The Conquest Caste warriors, accustomed to enemies who valued their own lives, were unprepared for opponents who treated their own safety as an acceptable loss for tactical advantage. The professor explained. Humans excel at Pyrrhic warfare, victories so costly that they become defeats for everyone involved. A granite student rumbled his confusion. But if they destroy the station, the humans die too. This achieves nothing. Professor Zixatheta's crystalline features shifted into what might have been a grim expression. That is where you misunderstand human psychology. Boulder, who thinks? Humans do not measure victory solely by survival or territorial gain. They measure it by the cost they inflict on their enemies relative to their own investment. The holographic battle continued. The humans fought with a creativity that disturbed many of the watching students. They used broken equipment as weapons, turned defensive barriers into traps, and employed their knowledge of human physiology in ways that seemed almost inhuman. Sergeant Santos herself demonstrated the concept perfectly, the professor said, zooming in on the human squad leader. When cornered by 3 Conquest caste warriors, she detonated an explosive device she had been carrying. The blast killed her instantly, but it also destroyed a critical junction that caused a cascade failure in the station's artificial gravity. The students watched as the gravity failure created chaos among the alien boarding parties. Beings evolved for high-gravity worlds suddenly found themselves floating helplessly, while their equipment, designed for stable environmental conditions, began malfunctioning. Swiftwing the Zephyrian fluttered nervously. She killed herself to achieve a temporary tactical advantage? This behavior seems pathological. To most species, yes, Professor Zixtheta agreed, but Sergeant Santos achieved something remarkable. Her death delayed the hegemony advance by 6 hours, while they attempted to restore gravity and regroup their forces. This gave the other human squads time to implement increasingly destructive defensive measures. The display showed the aftermath of the human strategy. Throughout Kepler Station, similar scenes were playing out. Human soldiers systematically turned every section into a costly battlefield, using tactics that prioritized enemy casualties over their own survival. The psychological effect on the hegemony forces was unprecedented, the professor continued. The Conquest caste warriors, bred for combat excellence, found themselves facing enemies who improved their performance when wounded, fought more aggressively when outnumbered, and celebrated small victories even as they died. A young student from the Silicon Collective, whose species communicated through harmonic frequencies, chimed a question. Professor, did any humans survive this engagement? 17 humans survived the battle, Professor Zixatheta replied, out of 300 who started. But their actions had consequences far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The display pulled back to show the entire battle from Admiral Thaxnos's perspective. The hegemony commander found himself in an impossible position. He had successfully captured Kepler Station, but at enormous cost. Admiral Thaxnos lost 60% of his boarding force to capture a facility that the humans had systematically destroyed during their defense, the professor explained. The station was unusable for its intended purpose. His elite warriors were demoralized by their first encounter with suicidal tactics, and word of the battle was spreading throughout his fleet. The students began to understand the broader implications. A victory that cost more than defeat was not actually a victory at all. But the true impact came from the recordings, Professor Zixtheta said, manipulating the display to show data streams. The humans had been transmitting everything. Every act of desperate courage, every Pyrrhic victory, every moment where human soldiers chose painful death over easy surrender, it was all broadcast across human communication networks. The professor's tone became more serious. The other human military units throughout the galaxy received these transmissions. They studied the tactics, they learned from the sacrifices, and they began to replicate the strategies. The students sat in uncomfortable silence as they processed this information. The idea of a species that learned and adapted suicidal tactics as standard military doctrine was deeply unsettling to most galactic civilizations. Professor Zixatheta allowed his students to absorb the implications before continuing. The holographic display now showed multiple human military units across the galaxy, each receiving and analyzing the Kepler Station transmissions. The sight of an entire species studying and preparing to replicate suicidal tactics disturbed many of the young aliens. Within 3 months of the Kepler Station incident, the professor continued, human military doctrine had fundamentally changed across all their forces. They formalized what they called mutually assured destruction tactics, strategies designed to ensure that attacking humans would cost enemies more than any possible victory could be worth. A crystalline student named Harmony of Light chimed in musical tones. Professor, This seems like an unstable military philosophy. Surely the humans would exhaust themselves using such costly methods. That was exactly what the hegemony leadership believed, Professor Zixatheta replied. Admiral Thaxnos reported to his superiors that humans were a minor threat that would eliminate themselves through reckless tactics. He recommended continued military pressure to accelerate their self-destruction. The display shifted to show hegemony war councils where alien leaders discussed their human problem. The arrogance in their planning was obvious to the students, who now knew this confidence was misplaced. The hegemony's next target was the human colony of New Brisbane, the professor said. Intelligence indicated it was a civilian settlement with minimal military presence. Only 50 human soldiers protecting 10,000 colonists. The hegemony sent a moderate force to capture the planet's rare mineral deposits. The display showed New Brisbane, a peaceful agricultural world with small cities scattered across green continents. It looked completely defenseless against military assault. What the hegemony did not understand, Professor Zixatheta explained, was that human civilians and soldiers are not distinct categories in the way most species organize their populations. Every human colonist had received the Kepler station recordings and had spent months preparing for potential attack. The students watched as the scene unfolded. When hegemony ships arrived in orbit, they expected quick surrender from a civilian population. Instead, they received a transmission from the colony's leader, Mayor Janet Rodriguez. The humans broadcast a simple message to the hegemony fleet, the professor said. You are welcome to take our planet. The burial costs for your forces will be included in the mineral extraction rights. Several students made sounds of confusion. The Mindweavers projected bewilderment through their telepathic emanations. Mayor Rodriguez was not making a threat, Professor Zixatheta clarified. She was making a business proposition. The humans had calculated the exact cost of conquering their planet and were politely informing their attackers of the price. The display showed the hegemony response. Admiral Thaxnos, still confident from his Pyrrhic victory at Kepler Station, ordered planetary bombardment to eliminate human defenses before landing troops. This is where the hegemony made their critical error, the professor said. They assumed human civilians would behave like civilians from other species, seeking shelter, fleeing or surrendering when faced with overwhelming force. Instead, the humans did something that shocked every military observer in the galaxy. When the bombardment began, instead of hiding, the colonists emerged from their homes and began working. They were implementing what they called scorched earth tactics, Professor Zixatheta explained. The humans had prepared to systematically destroy everything of value on their planet rather than allow enemies to benefit from conquest. The students watched in fascination and horror as human civilians demolished their own infrastructure with methodical efficiency. Mines were collapsed, factories were destroyed, water systems were poisoned, and food supplies were burned. Vash the Kethmari spoke up, her scales shifting to darker blue in distress. Professor, they are destroying their own civilization. How can this be considered rational military strategy? Because humans understand something about warfare that most species do not, the professor replied. They know that military conquest is only successful if it yields benefits greater than its costs. By eliminating those benefits, humans make victory meaningless. The holographic battle showed hegemony forces landing on a planet that was systematically destroying itself around them. Every facility they tried to secure was either already destroyed or heavily booby-trapped. The 50 human soldiers had trained the civilians in guerrilla warfare, Professor Zixatheta continued. But this was not ordinary resistance. The humans fought with the explicit goal of ensuring that every day of occupation would cost the hegemony more resources than they could extract from the planet. The display zoomed in on specific engagements. Human civilians, including elderly individuals and adolescents, fought with improvised weapons and homemade explosives. They showed the same disturbing psychology as the soldiers at Kepler Station, becoming more dangerous when wounded and celebrating small victories even as they died. The siege of New Brisbane lasted 4 months, the professor said. The hegemony successfully conquered the planet, but they captured a wasteland populated by ghosts. Every human settlement had been systematically destroyed. Every human civilian had become a guerrilla fighter. Every day of occupation required massive military resources just to prevent further sabotage. A granite student named Mountain Heart rumbled thoughtfully. The humans lost their planet and their lives. How can this be considered victory? Professor Zixatheta's 6 eyes focused on the student. Because human concepts of victory and defeat operate on longer timescales than most species consider. The humans at New Brisbane were not fighting for their own survival. They were fighting to establish a precedent for future conflicts. The display showed the broader strategic situation. News of New Brisbane's destruction had spread throughout the galaxy, reaching both human colonies and potential enemies. The lesson was clear to every civilization monitoring the conflict, the professor explained. Attacking humans would be enormously expensive even against civilian targets. The humans had demonstrated that they would rather destroy their own possessions than allow enemies to benefit from conquest. The students began to grasp the terrifying implications. A species that would systematically destroy its own civilization, rather than accept defeat, could not be conquered through conventional military means. But the most disturbing aspect came next. Professor Zixatheta said, his voice dropping. The humans began to enjoy their reputation. The display showed human colonies throughout the galaxy receiving news of New Brisbane's destruction. Instead of mourning or fear, the reaction showed something else entirely: pride and anticipation. Human military recruitment increased by 300% after New Brisbane, the professor continued. Their soldiers began decorating their equipment with symbols representing successful Pyrrhic victories. They created medals specifically for actions that resulted in mutually assured destruction. The students sat in uncomfortable silence as they processed this information. The idea of a species that celebrated costly victories as achievements was difficult for most galactic civilizations to comprehend. The classroom atmosphere had grown noticeably tense as Professor Zixatheta's lecture continued. The young aliens were beginning to understand why their textbooks contained so few details about human military capabilities. The holographic display now showed the aftermath of New Brisbane, with empty cities and scarred landscapes serving as monuments to human stubbornness. The hegemony leadership faced an unprecedented strategic problem, the professor explained. Their military doctrine was based on cost-benefit analysis. Conquest was profitable when the value of captured resources exceeded the cost of military operations. Humans had made this equation impossible to balance. A young vaporous student named Drift Through Clouds condensed her form to speak clearly. Surely the hegemony could simply avoid human territories. Why not ignore them and focus on more profitable conquests? Professor Zixatheta's crystalline features shifted in what other species recognized as grim amusement. That was indeed their initial strategy. But humans are not content to be ignored. They began to actively interfere with hegemony operations throughout the galaxy. The display changed to show star maps marking various conflicts. Red indicators showed hegemony military operations, while blue markers indicated human interference. There were far too many blue markers for a supposedly minor species. Humans began offering their services as mercenaries to any civilization under hegemony attack. The professor continued. But they were not fighting for payment or territory. They were fighting specifically to make conquest expensive for their enemies. The students watched recordings of human mercenary companies arriving at various battlefields. These were not traditional soldiers seeking victory through conventional tactics. They were specialists in making wars too costly to continue. The human mercenary company called Hell's Accountants became particularly notorious, Professor Zixatheta said. They advertised their services with the slogan, "We guarantee your enemies will lose money." Their contract terms were unique in galactic military history. The display showed a typical Hell's Accountants contract. The students read the terms with growing amazement and horror. Thought Drifter, the Mindweaver, projected confusion. Professor, this contract promises that the humans will achieve victory or ensure mutual destruction. They offer no option for conventional defeat. How can military contractors guarantee such impossible terms? Because humans redefined military success, Professor Zixatheta replied. Traditional military thinking focuses on achieving objectives while preserving forces. Human military thinking focuses on achieving objectives or denying them to enemies, regardless of cost to themselves. The display showed Hell's Accountants in action during the siege of Tartarus Prime. The planet was under attack by a massive hegemony invasion force, and conventional defenders were clearly outmatched. Then the human mercenaries arrived with just 200 soldiers. The humans immediately began implementing what they called economic warfare, the professor explained. Instead of engaging the hegemony fleet directly, they targeted the invasion supply chains with surgical precision. The students watched as small human teams infiltrated hegemony supply ships and systematically destroyed or contaminated cargo. Food supplies were poisoned, ammunition was sabotaged, and fuel systems were rigged to explode during use. But the truly diabolical aspect of their strategy, the professor continued, was that they made these attacks look like accidents. Hegemony forces began suffering equipment failures, food poisoning, and supply shortages that appeared to be the result of poor logistics rather than enemy action. Swiftwing the Zephyrian fluttered her wings nervously. This seems like inefficient combat. Why not attack the enemy directly? Professor Zix Theta manipulated the display to show the economic impact of the human strategy. Because direct attacks produce immediate tactical results but limited strategic consequences, human economic warfare produced compound effects that grew over time. The data showed hegemony costs escalating exponentially. Every day of occupation required increased resources to replace sabotaged supplies. Every piece of equipment had to be inspected for tampering. Every meal had to be tested for contamination. The invasion became impossibly expensive to maintain. After 6 months of human economic warfare, the professor said, the hegemony was spending more resources maintaining their supply chains than they could possibly extract from conquered territory. The invasion became a net loss regardless of military success. The students began to understand the insidious nature of human tactics. They were not winning through superior strength or technology, but by making victory economically impossible. The hegemony commander, Admiral Vexthor of the Strategic Caste, made the same error as his predecessors, Professor Zixtheta continued. He decided to eliminate the human mercenaries through direct confrontation. The display showed Admiral Vexthor's elite forces hunting the human teams throughout the planetary system. It should have been a simple operation. 200 humans against thousands of highly trained alien warriors. What Admiral Vexthor discovered was that humans had weaponized their own expendability, the professor explained. The mercenaries fought with tactics that assumed their own death was inevitable and planned accordingly. The students watched in fascination as human teams engaged hegemony forces in battles designed to be as costly as possible for everyone involved. Humans would lure enemies into areas rigged with massive explosives, sacrifice themselves to destroy critical enemy equipment, and use their dying moments to transmit intelligence to other human units. The most disturbing incident occurred when a single human operative named Marcus Webb was cornered by an entire hegemony strike team, Professor Zixtheta said, zooming in on one particular engagement. The display showed a human soldier surrounded by 20 alien warriors in powered armor. By any rational assessment, he should have surrendered or attempted to escape. Instead, Marcus Webb smiled and spoke into his communication device. The professor continued. He said in control, "This is Webb. I'm about to solve our ammunition shortage problem. Tell my mom this was awesome." The students watched in shocked silence as the human detonated an improvised nuclear device that he had been carrying. The explosion destroyed not only the strike team, but also a significant portion of the hegemony's forward operating base. Boulder, who thinks, rumbled in confusion. He carried a nuclear weapon into combat? How is this tactically sound? Because humans view their own lives as expendable resources in service of strategic objectives, Professor Zixtheta replied. Marcus Webb's death eliminated 43 enemy soldiers, destroyed millions of credits worth of equipment, and forced the hegemony to completely revise their security protocols. The display showed the aftermath of Webb's sacrifice. Hegemony forces were now required to scan every engagement for potential nuclear threats, maintain safe distances during combat, and assume that any human might be carrying weapons of mass destruction. The psychological impact was devastating, the professor continued. Hegemony soldiers began to fear individual human mercenaries more than entire alien armies, because humans could not be relied upon to value their own survival above mission objectives. The students sat in uncomfortable silence, processing the implications of warfare against opponents who treated death as an acceptable tactical option. Several looked physically ill at the concept. Professor Zixtheta, observed his students' disturbed expressions before continuing with the most crucial part of the lesson. The holographic display now showed a galactic map with red zones spreading like infection across former hegemony territories. Each zone represented an area where human mercenary companies had made conquest economically impossible. The situation reached a critical point during the Battle of the Nexus Gates, the professor said. The hegemony leadership realized that human interference was not a temporary problem to be solved, but a permanent strategic threat that would destroy their entire military expansion philosophy. The display focused on the Nexus Gates, a system of ancient alien jump portals that connected different sectors of the galaxy. Control of these gates meant control of interstellar trade and military movement. The hegemony had invested centuries of effort and resources to capture them. High Admiral Kithex of the Supreme War Council made a fateful decision. Professor Zixitheta continued. He declared that humans must be completely eliminated from the galaxy before their tactical philosophy could spread to other species. A crystalline student named Pure Resonance chimed anxiously. Professor, surely genocide is prohibited under galactic law. The hegemony could not simply exterminate an entire species. The hegemony classified it as strategic sterilization of a military threat, the professor replied grimly. They assembled the largest military force in galactic history, over 10,000 ships and 5 million soldiers. Their plan was to simultaneously attack every human colony and eliminate the species before they could implement their self-destructive tactics on a galactic scale. The students watched in horrified fascination as the display showed the massive hegemony armada gathering near the galactic core. The size of the force was overwhelming, easily large enough to conquer hundreds of star systems. The human response to this threat revealed the final aspect of their psychology that makes them truly dangerous. Professor Zixitheta said, his voice becoming more serious. When faced with existential threats, humans do not become more cautious or defensive. They become exponentially more aggressive. The display showed human colonies receiving news of the approaching extermination fleet. Instead of panic or attempts to flee, the responses showed careful preparation and what could only be described as anticipation. The human colonial government issued a statement that became known as the Galactic Ultimatum. The professor continued. It was broadcast to every civilization in the galaxy simultaneously. The text of the ultimatum appeared on the display. The students read it with growing amazement at its audacity. To all species currently observing this conflict, Professor Zixitheta read aloud. The hegemony has chosen to attempt our extinction. We accept this challenge. However, we want to be clear about the consequences of their decision. If the human species is destroyed, we will ensure that the cost of our elimination exceeds the value of every resource the hegemony has ever captured. We have prepared for this possibility. Sincerely, the Human Defense Coordination Council. P.S. This is going to be expensive for everyone. Several students made sounds of disbelief. The idea of a species facing extinction and treating it as a business transaction was incomprehensible to most galactic civilizations. Vash the Kethmari spoke up, her scales now deep purple with stress. Professor, what did they mean by prepared for this possibility? How can a doomed species threaten their destroyers? That question was answered when the hegemony fleet arrived at the first human colony world. Professor Zixitheta replied. The planet was called Haven, and it had been completely evacuated. But the humans had left something behind. The display showed the hegemony fleet approaching an apparently empty world. Long-range scans detected no life signs and minimal infrastructure. It appeared that the humans had simply abandoned their colony. Admiral Kithex ordered a standard planetary bombardment to eliminate any hidden defenses before moving on to the next target, the professor continued. The first bombardment missile struck the planet's surface and detonated normally. The second missile triggered something unprecedented. The students watched as the planet's surface erupted in a chain reaction that consumed the entire world. The explosion was visible from neighboring star systems and completely destroyed several hegemony ships that had been too close to the planet. The humans had converted their entire planet into a weapon, Professor Zixitheta explained. They had honeycombed the crust with nuclear devices and antimatter charges, turning the world itself into the largest explosive device ever created. The classroom fell silent as the implications became clear. a species willing to destroy entire planets, rather than allow enemies to benefit from conquest, was not just dangerous, it was apocalyptic. But the destruction of Haven was only the beginning, the professor continued. As the hegemony fleet moved to the next target, they received intelligence reports that fundamentally changed their understanding of what they were facing. The display showed intercepted human communications revealing the scope of their preparations. Over 60 human colonies had been similarly converted into planetary-scale weapons. The humans had spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario. The human strategy was called mutually assured galactic destruction, Professor Zixtheta said. They had calculated that exploding 60 planets simultaneously would create gravitational disruptions and debris fields that would destabilize space travel throughout the entire galactic arm. Deep thinker the Mindweaver projected horrified realization. Professor, such destruction would damage every civilization in the galaxy, not just the hegemony. The humans were threatening to destroy galactic civilization itself, rather than accept extinction. Precisely, Professor Zixtheta replied. Humans had weaponized the concept of spite on a cosmic scale. They were prepared to ensure that if they could not exist, the galaxy itself would be damaged beyond repair for thousands of years. The students processed this information with growing horror. The idea of a species willing to commit cosmic suicide to spite their enemies challenged every assumption about rational behavior. High Admiral Kythex found himself facing an impossible decision, the professor continued. He could proceed with human extermination and watch galactic civilization collapse, or he could retreat and accept that humans had made themselves untouchable through sheer destructive potential. The display showed frantic communications between hegemony leadership as they tried to find a solution to the human problem. Every option led to unacceptable consequences. The final factor that forced hegemony capitulation was a simple human message broadcast to the entire galaxy, Professor Zixtheta said. It came from a human admiral named Sarah Chen, speaking from the bridge of Earth's last remaining defense station. The students listened as the recorded message played. Admiral Chen's voice was calm and professional, as if she were discussing routine business rather than galactic annihilation. Admiral Kythex, we understand your frustration with our tactical philosophy. However, we want to remind you that spite is not a temporary emotional state for humans. It is a cultural value that we teach to our children. Even if you succeed in killing every human currently alive, our automated systems will continue implementing spite-based warfare for the next 1,000 years. We have prepared for this contingency as well. The choice is yours. The message was accompanied by technical specifications for self-replicating military drones that would continue human tactics even after human extinction. The drones were programmed with one simple directive: make military conquest as expensive as possible for any aggressive species. Admiral Kythex realized that humans had created a tactical philosophy that would outlive their own species. Professor Zixtheta explained, even successful genocide would not eliminate the human threat. It would perpetuate it indefinitely. The display showed the hegemony fleet withdrawing from human space while their leadership grappled with an opponent who had made victory literally impossible. The humans had achieved something unprecedented in galactic military history. They had become too dangerous to attack and too expensive to ignore. Hegemony's withdrawal marked the end of their expansion era, the professor continued. Word of their defeat by a species 1/10 their size spread throughout the galaxy. Other civilizations began studying human tactics and implementing similar strategies in their own defense planning. The students watched as the galactic map changed, showing the rapid spread of human-inspired military doctrine. Species after species began adopting spite-based defensive strategies, making conquest economically impossible throughout entire sectors. Within 50 years, the entire concept of military expansion had become obsolete, Professor Zixtheta said. The human tactical philosophy had created a galactic Mexican standoff, where everyone was too dangerous to attack and too expensive to conquer. Harmony of Light chimed a final question. Professor, what happened to the hegemony after their defeat? Did they collapse entirely? The hegemony adapted, Professor Zixtheta replied. They discovered that humans, despite their destructive capabilities, were remarkably reasonable when approached through diplomatic rather than military channels. Human spite only activated in response to aggression. They had no interest in initiating conflicts that would be expensive for everyone involved. The display showed the eventual peace treaties and trade agreements that emerged from the crisis. The galaxy had been forced to evolve beyond military conquest through sheer necessity. Professor Zix Theta paused to let his students absorb the full implications of the lesson before delivering its conclusion. The holographic display now showed the current galactic political map, with human territories marked in blue and clearly labeled as protected under Treaty of Seven Suns, military intervention. Prohibited. This brings us to the present day and the answer to Vash's original question, the professor said, his 6 eyes focusing on the young Kethmari student. Humans are forbidden from galactic warfare not because they are weak, but because they are too effective at making warfare unprofitable for everyone involved. The display showed the text of the Treaty of Seven Suns, the most important military agreement in galactic history. Its primary clause was simple and direct. No signatory civilization shall employ, contract, or request military assistance from human forces under any circumstances. Swiftwing the Zephyrian fluttered her wings thoughtfully. Professor, if humans are so effective at warfare, why would anyone agree to prohibit their participation? Surely having human allies would guarantee victory. Professor Zixatheta's crystalline features shifted in what might have been amusement. That question reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of what victory means in the context of human military philosophy. Let me share what happened when the Vegan Republic attempted to hire human mercenaries during the Chrome Wars. The display showed the conflict between the Vegan Republic and the Machine Collective, 2 civilizations fighting over rare computational matrices needed for advanced AI development. It was a conventional resource war with clear strategic objectives. The Vegan Republic was losing badly and decided to hire the human company called Problem Solvers Incorporated. The professor continued. The humans accepted the contract with their usual terms: victory or mutually assured destruction, no middle ground. The students watched as human forces arrived in the war zone and immediately began implementing their characteristic tactics. Instead of engaging the Machine Collective directly, they began sabotaging the computational matrices that both sides were fighting to control. The humans correctly identified that the war's entire premise was based on acquiring intact matrices, Professor Zixatheta explained. They systematically destroyed every matrix in the disputed territory, making victory impossible for either side. The display showed the aftermath of human intervention. Both the Vegan Republic and Machine Collective found themselves fighting over worthless, contaminated territory while the humans prepared increasingly destructive contingencies. When the Machine Collective attempted to withdraw from the conflict, the humans pursued them and began destroying matrices in undisputed machine territory. The professor continued. When the Vegan Republic tried to negotiate a ceasefire, the humans informed them that their contract specified victory or mutual destruction. Surrender was not an available option. Several students made sounds of horrified understanding. A species that would not allow their own employers to surrender had weaponized the concept of commitment. Thought drifter. The Mind Weaver projected bewildered realization. Professor, the humans turned their allies' war into an existential threat for everyone involved. How can this be considered successful military service? Because the humans achieved their contractual obligation, Professor Zixatheta replied. They guaranteed that the Vegan Republic would not lose the war. Of course, they also guaranteed that no one could win the war, but their contract terms were technically satisfied. The display showed the final resolution of the Chrome Wars. After 18 months of escalating destruction, both sides agreed to abandon the disputed territory entirely and sign a permanent non-aggression pact. The humans collected their payment and left behind a sector of space that both civilizations were too afraid to enter. The Chrome Wars demonstrated why human military service is fundamentally incompatible with conventional warfare, the professor explained. Their tactical philosophy transforms every conflict into an existential crisis that no one can afford to continue. A young student from the Hive Collective buzzed a question through their translation device. Professor, surely there must be ways to control or limit human military effectiveness. Other species have developed countermeasures. Professor Zixatheta manipulated the display to show various attempts by different civilizations to neutralize human tactics. Each attempt had failed spectacularly. The Andromedans tried using overwhelming force to eliminate humans before they could implement spite-based tactics, the professor said. The humans responded by developing faster spite deployment methods. The Rigel Syndicate attempted to negotiate limited warfare with specific rules of engagement. The humans agreed to the rules and then found creative ways to implement mutual destruction within those constraints. The display showed each failed countermeasure in detail. Every attempt to limit or control human military capabilities had resulted in humans becoming more dangerous and unpredictable. The most ambitious attempt was made by the Galactic Council itself. Professor Zixatheta continued. They offered humans membership in the Council in exchange for agreeing to fight conventional wars with conventional tactics. The students leaned forward, curious about this diplomatic solution. The human representative, Ambassador Liu Wei, politely declined the offer. The professor said. His exact words were, "Thank you for the invitation, but we prefer our current reputation. Being too dangerous to fight is much more efficient than being strong enough to win." The classroom fell silent as the students processed this final lesson. Humans had deliberately chosen to remain outside galactic civilization rather than abandon the tactical philosophy that made them untouchable. This is why the Treaty of Seven Suns was necessary, Professor Zixtheta concluded. Not to protect the galaxy from human aggression, but to protect the galaxy from human solutions to military problems. When humans solve conflicts, no one wins, but everyone survives to regret starting the fight in the first place. The holographic display showed the current state of the galaxy, peaceful and prosperous under the treaty's protection. Wars still occurred, but they remained limited and conventional because everyone understood that human intervention would make them too expensive to continue. The lesson here is fundamental to understanding galactic politics, the professor said, addressing his students directly. Power is not always measured by the ability to win conflicts. Sometimes the greatest power comes from the ability to make conflicts too costly for anyone to start. Boulder, who thinks, rumbled thoughtfully. Professor, what would happen if the treaty were violated? If someone did hire human military forces? Professor Zixatheta's 6 eyes gleamed with something that might have been concern. That scenario is covered in your advanced strategic studies courses next semester. For now, let it suffice to say that every galactic civilization has a vested interest in ensuring the treaty remains intact. The professor dismissed the holographic display and faced his students directly. Your assignment for next class is to research one example of human peaceful problem-solving in civilian contexts. You will discover that their approach to business negotiations, scientific research, and even entertainment follows the same underlying philosophy that makes them too dangerous for military service. As the students gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Vash the Kethmari approached the professor with one final question. Professor, she said quietly, are humans actually as dangerous as this lesson suggests? Or is their reputation based on fear and misunderstanding? Professor Zixatheta considered the question carefully before responding. Vash, the most terrifying aspect of human psychology is that they genuinely believe their actions are reasonable and proportionate. They do not see themselves as dangerous. They see themselves as efficient problem solvers. That disconnect between human self-perception and galactic reality is what makes them truly unpredictable. The young Kethmari student left the classroom with much to consider, as did her classmates. They had learned why humans were forbidden from galactic warfare, but more importantly, they had learned to appreciate the peaceful stability that this prohibition provided to civilized space. In the corridors outside the lecture hall, students from different species discussed the lesson in hushed tones, each wondering what other human capabilities were being carefully managed by galactic treaty. The lesson had ended, but the education in human psychology was just beginning.